Hello, everyone. This is Christina Jang here, and welcome to our webinar today. Before we begin, there are a few things to note. Yes, this webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and PowerPoint will be available online on our website within a week. To interact with me and our host today, please submit questions through the Q&A function at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen, and please refrain from using the chat box. I also encourage you to enter questions throughout today's presentations. Again, thank you all for joining our webinar today titled Ride Fair, a policy framework for managing transportation network companies, or for short, TNCs. With the rapid pace of change that TNCs like Uber, Lyft, and Didi have made in transport demands, cities are evaluating best practices to regulate these industries. The first half of today's webinar will review ITDP's new report that highlights key cities that regulate TNCs to maximize the benefits they present and how to manage its costs. The second half of our webinar will enter a deep dive look into Mexico City, where Laura Ballesteros will discuss her experiences developing Latin America's first TNC regulation, the city's motivations, and challenges the city faces. Today, our presenters are Dana Yanocha, author of the new report, and Laura Ballesteros, former congresswoman at Mexico's City Local Assembly. Dana is a senior research associate on ITDP's global programs. Her work includes research and analysis of trends in sustainable transportation and development. Recently, she moderated a panel at the annual summit of the Shared Use Mobility Center in Chicago, a panel focused on regional approaches to encourage the adoption and use of shared modes, such as car share, bike share, and ride share. Her most notable works from 2018 include a policy brief on optimizing dockless bike share for cities and ITDP's bike share planning guide. If you're interested, please check out our webinar archives to see those recordings as well. And secondly, we have Laura Ballesteros, a young politician and activist with 15 years experience in the public and private sphere, and also an expert in policy and regulation in urban affairs. Currently, Laura is a substitute senator for 2018 to 2024, and also the technical secretary of the initiative, Women in Motion. Prior to this role, she served as Undersecretary of Planning in the Ministry of Mobility of Mexico City, and undertook the first regulation of transport digital platform companies such as Uber and Cabify, and worked with the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing on Mexico City's transformational off-street parking regulation, leading the coalition as well as leading the coalition to build the city's road safety policy, adopting Vision Zero philosophies. Now I'll hand it off to you, Dana. Please feel free to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Christina. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, are you able to see the title slide?
Yes, everything is clear on my end.
Great, okay, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. I'm really excited that you're all here for the launch of this brand new ITDP report on managing transportation network companies. So for my part of the webinar today, I wanted to first give a little bit of context on TNCs and some of the challenges that cities have had in managing these companies. And then I want to talk through our approach for developing this report, and then spend the bulk of the time looking at 4 key regulatory elements that we identified and recommend cities include in their TNC regulations going forward. And then finally touch on a couple of structural barriers that might be preventing cities from taking action on regulating TNCs. So just so we all are starting from sort of a common foundation, I wanted to provide the definition that we use in the report for transportation network companies, or TNCs. So these are digital applications that match potential riders, or in some cases, deliveries with drivers in real time. So many of us are probably familiar with Uber. They have a global presence, but there are a number of other operators that have sort of more regional dominance, such as Ola in India, 99 in Latin America, and Gojek and Grab in Southeast Asia. So when we think about the challenges that cities have faced in terms of trying to manage TNCs, I wanted to underscore this idea that TNCs are not going to be able to substitute for a robust high capacity transit network. And they're also not going to be able to substitute for compact pedestrian friendly development. But what they have been successful in doing is providing connections to and from transit, especially when we think about connecting to commuter lines. And they've also been successful in meeting needs for more specific use cases, like providing flexibility for complex trips where maybe you're carrying a lot of bags or carrying heavy equipment and or potentially traveling with someone who has limited mobility and might not feel comfortable walking half a mile to the nearest transit station. So given these use cases and the fact that TNC operations and use of TNCs have grown really rapidly over the past 7 or 8 years or so, cities have felt the need to be responsive to this rising mode and have really been expected to constantly adapt to these evolving technologies, new business models, and really shifting public interests around TNC operation. And at the same time, TNCs are starting to offer services beyond their traditional for hire passenger transport to include services like bike share and scooter share, and also food and other delivery services. So the business models are expanding, and these new services are sort of breaking the barriers of just traditional passenger transport. So while policy approaches have emerged in some cities as a response, a really effective holistic policy to regulating TNCs, specifically with goals for how TNCs can actually support sustainable transport, has been difficult to find. And at the same time, cities are still grappling with the question of whether TNCs actually support or compete with transit, walking, and cycling trips. You can see there's sort of a discrepancy in the headlines that are on this slide. There have been some reports that have linked TNCs to increased congestion in major cities, particularly stemming from those really efficient zero passenger miles or deadhead miles. Those are miles that are driven between passenger trips. There have also been some studies that have found links between the entry of TNCs into cities and falling transit ridership, particularly bus ridership. But other studies have found that TNCs actually complement transit. And then additionally, there are other concerns that stem from the unclear financial sustainability of TNC business models and just a general lack of transparency about profitability in the long term. So there isn't really consensus in this area, and that's made it really challenging for cities to start to plot an informed path forward. So recognizing these uncertainties and the fact that demand for TNCs is continuing to grow, you can see in the really steep slopes of the graphs on this slide. These are showing Uber and Lyft trips per day in Seattle and in New York City. Cities are starting to realize that they need to proactively work to ensure that TNCs operate as a positive piece of a well-functioning transportation network, and that TNCs can remain available for those use cases where they actually do make a lot of sense and fill some gaps in the network. So how can cities do this? Well, they can set clear outcome-oriented regulations for TNCs. And this can really lead to maximizing the benefits that TNCs offer, like potentially reducing single occupancy vehicle trips and enabling people to live car light or even car free. But also working to minimize the costs like congestion, like pulling riders from public transit, and working to reduce those zero passenger miles. So at ITDP, we recognize the need for a framework that really moves cities towards a more holistic regulation of TNCs. And our approach for developing this report started out with a couple of case studies on some of the earliest TNC regulations. The first was in Mexico City, which passed the first TNC regulation in Latin America. And we're really lucky to have Laura here today to provide a really deep dive into that process. And we also looked at Sao Paulo, which was another early adopter of TNC regulations in Latin America. And then we supplemented those case studies with in-depth reviews of regulations in both Chicago and London, both of which have fairly comprehensive policies, but still some gaps and some room for improvement there. We also reviewed some literature and other existing reports on TNC regulations. And finally, we interviewed a number of experts from government, and we also interviewed TNC operators and taxi operators to better understand their experiences and really gather on the ground knowledge about their priorities for regulation. And all of that together ultimately led to the identification of common challenges across cities that are limiting their ability to act on TNCs. And we were also able to come up with some recommendations to address these challenges based on suggestions from the folks that we interviewed and some best practice examples that emerged from our case studies. So all of those inputs eventually fed into our development of this decision-making framework. And this might look familiar to some of you since we introduced a similar framework for managing dockless bike share in a policy brief that ITDP released last year. Similar to that effort, the idea here is really to encourage cities to think more holistically about TNCs and how they can operate most effectively in the context of the existing transportation network. So the key is really starting with identifying goals for TNC operations. And these goals can vary from city to city. It might include reducing single occupancy vehicle trips or reducing household car ownership or anything sort of related to those types of goals. And then once those are identified, policies should be put in place to move operators towards aligning with those goals. And then we also identify in the next stage 4 key regulatory elements, which are shown in the blue boxes in this graphic. And these are elements that we are recommending cities include in their TNC regulations. And I'm going to talk about these in more detail in the next couple of slides. It's also critical in the next stage, stage 3, for cities to hire staff or at least to assign responsibility for TNC management to existing staff and also to establish protocols for monitoring and enforcing policy compliance. And then the final stage of the framework is to build in opportunities to analyze data and evaluate policies, and doing so in an effort to consider any new technology or business models that may have emerged since initial policies were implemented. So these 4 critical regulatory elements, which are pricing, metrics, data, and regional coordination, should be included in any city's TNC regulatory strategy in order to ensure that TNCs are actually contributing to broader transportation and sustainability goals. So there are a number of approaches and implementation strategies for each of these, and cities should be sure to evaluate their available resources, government priorities and capacities, and any other related factors when considering how best to implement each of these elements. But overall, it's really important that cities take a system level approach and build in opportunities to evaluate how these elements are working over time. So I want to spend a couple of minutes going through each of the 4 elements individually. And the first is using pricing to incentivize shared, shorter, and less frequent trips. So there's a couple of different strategies that cities can pursue, but ultimately pricing should penalize inefficient routes and those inefficient 0 passenger miles, and it should reward shared trips and trips that serve neighborhoods that are disconnected from transit. So the most commonly used pricing lever that we've seen cities implement is the use of surcharges. These are typically applied as either a static price per trip or as a dynamic surcharge, which is set at a percentage of the trip cost, and that can help to incentivize shorter trips. But there are other types of dynamic surcharges that can differ depending on occupancy rates, which is actually currently being proposed in San Francisco. Another pricing strategy is a price per kilometer traveled or road use charge for TNCs, which was enacted in Sao Paulo. Vehicle kilometer traveled fees more directly address those inefficient zero passenger miles and also encourage shared trips. And in the case of Sao Paulo's road use charge, the city actually has flexibility to adjust the charge during peak times or for trips to and from underserved areas, or to provide discounts to preferred vehicles like electric vehicles or accessible vehicles. But ultimately, all vehicle travel should really be priced for negatively contributing to congestion and to pollution. And some cities have actually adopted congestion pricing schemes to that end. Congestion pricing also incentivizes shared trips and really highly disincentivizes zero passenger miles. But the integration of TNCs into congestion pricing schemes has varied across cities that have congestion pricing. So in London, TNCs are currently exempt from the congestion charge there, but in Stockholm, TNCs as well as taxis and for hire vehicles all pay the congestion fee. So the second key element is using metrics to establish baselines and better understand TNC impacts. Good metrics are going to help cities understand and quantify the impacts of TNCs on those broader environmental, economic, and sustainability goals in order to ensure that public interests are being protected and to be able to track system performance over time. So without those metrics, it's really difficult to evaluate how the system is performing and what can actually be done to move the system toward those broader targets. So we have some metrics proposed in this chart that cities could adopt and start collecting data towards. And I think it's important to note that each of these metrics is tied to a specific goal. So whether that's promoting spatial equity or reducing congestion or maintaining safety or reducing emissions. And I think a good example of the use of metrics in sort of a real world case is in the state of California, which recently passed a bill that requires TNCs to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions. And those reports will help the state to set emissions reduction goals for the TNC sector going forward. The third key regulatory element is data and the use of operator data for policy enforcement and evaluation. There are two key pieces of data that are going to help cities enforce and evaluate these policies. And the first is real-time data on active vehicle locations. This is really important for monitoring and enforcement, and it can be done by operators supplying cities with a verified API. Cities may also want to consider making these feeds available for third-party app developers who are developing trip planning applications, and also potentially for research purposes. And then the other key piece is more periodic reports on things like trips, crashes, complaints, or other operational information. And both of those data pieces should be submitted to trained city staff who are going to be able to field verify that data and then use it for monitoring and enforcement, as well as for more long-term analysis of trends towards the improvement of regulations over time. So a city that is doing this really well in terms of TNCs is Chicago, which has really clear standards for monthly reporting that includes data points like trip origin and destinations, vehicle and driver details, trip requests and collisions. They have a lot of standardized reporting requirements that makes that really clear for operators to submit that data to the city. And then the final key element is this idea of regional coordination, or facilitating connectivity through regulation at a regional level. This could help to reduce duplicated staff time and any associated administrative costs for managing the system, but also for enforcement. And it may also help to streamline communication channels between operators and the public. So 2 examples of this approach are shown in the maps on this slide. The first one is in Greater London, where Transport for London is the agency that's responsible for managing transportation across all of metropolitan London. And that agency also regulates TNCs and other private hire vehicles, not only for the City of London, but for all of the surrounding 32 boroughs, instead of each of those borough councils adopting its own individual TNC regulations. And then similarly in the US, in Washington state, the city of Olympia was given legal authority by the county government to oversee TNC regulations on behalf of 2 smaller neighboring municipalities, Lacey and Tumwater, which are highlighted in yellow on that map. And that was done to simplify permitting and to maintain common regulatory implementation across that region. And then the last point I want to touch on is this idea of barriers that may be in place that are actually preventing cities from moving forward and adopting some of these elements that I just talked through. We know that regulating TNCs has been a real challenge for cities, and that often a combination of these structural barriers have actually prevented a comprehensive regulatory strategy from being implemented. So in the report, we identify these 3 major structural challenges, which are shown on the slide here. And we also identify some recommendations for addressing them, with the idea that lowering these barriers can help to enable cities to design and implement more comprehensive goal-oriented TNC regulations. So I think I'll end there. And just a reminder that this report is now available on ITDP's website. I have the link here, and I'm sure Christina will provide that link in a follow-up email to the webinar.
Great, thank you, Dana. And yes, we'll be sharing the report after today's webinar, so everyone will have the links in their email. As for the questions that are coming through, please make sure to include relevant questions regarding regulating TNCs and actual mobility itself. We won't be addressing so many local regulations, as well as things related to labor, so those working in TNC industries. So now, Laura, we can hand it off to you. Dana, if you could stop sharing your screen, Laura will be able to share hers. Thank you so much, Dana.
Are you seeing it right now?
Hi, Laura. Yes, I can see your screen. It's just in regular mode right now. If you could put it to presenter.
Yeah.
Full screen.
Perfect.
Great. It looks great.
Here we are. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it will be my pleasure to share with you the experience of Mexico City, starting with all this process that we began almost 6 years ago in order to change the mobility model in our city, one of the biggest cities on the earth. And this challenge specifically was one of the most important. First of all, we start to create 3 different steps in order to change this mobility model. Why? Because when we are talking about Latin American cities, especially, of course, also Asian and American ones, we have a very motorized model. So in order to change that into a sustainable mobility model, it is important to change a lot of things. And of course, if we are talking about digital policy, it is bigger, the effort that we have to make. So the first step, it is politics. How we can transform our cities with politics. I mean, I know we don't like it. Nobody wants to be inside of it, but we need to put hands on over it, because we need champions inside the government in order to make things happen. So this politics, one of the most right now, the most important names that we know about it is governance. So these changes are restricted into the legislative and the administrative changes. The second step is policy. Once we are changing politics through legislative and administrative changes, we have to start creating our new policy. So planning and regulation is very important, because we are not going to be in the government forever. And we do need specific regulation in black and white paper in order to make this happen for the next years. We are trying to do here some long-term changes. That's why it is very important to have it like that. And the third step, it is the performance, new mobility culture. If we are not able to prove it on the street with infrastructure and with this new regulation, we are not going to be able to prove it, to prove these changes. So this is very, very important. So when we are talking specifically about TNC's changes in Mexico City, I would like to start talking about the background in the world of these new technologies. In March of 2010, the status of Uber Cab starts in the US. Then in 2011, start Cabify in Spain. And in June of 2014, Uber starts the activities in Mexico. This is important to notice, because we started to work the new mobility law, one of our most important regulations in Mexico City, that allowed it since that moment the operation of these private companies. We started to work the mobility law in 2012. And since then, we analyzed it when I was part of the Congress in that time, that it was imminent, the entrance of these new systems into our city. So we prepare our new mobility frame law, thinking about that since 2010 in the United States, and since 2011 in Spain, these companies started the operation. So we needed at that time to be ready. And we were. That was one of our biggest advantages in this. So 3 of 10 people approved taxi service. These numbers are very important also in our city, because the taxi service right now, and since then, they are not providing the users the kind of service that they deserve. So in terms of security, in terms of quality of the service, they are not doing their jobs. And this is not only a problem about the taxi drivers organizations, it is just also a problem about the government and their regulation. So the thing is that right now they are still with a very low percentage of approbation in the city, and the users are asking for more in terms of the quality of the service. 1 of 10 consider taxis as a safe form of transportation. This is a very, very low average too, and especially women. The women are the most vulnerable sector of our population in this specific branch of transportation, with kidnapping, of course, assaulting and murder. So for us, it's a very, very important matter in terms of regulation and policy when we are talking about the city. So also one of the most important things here to understand about Mexico City and our policy and regulation strategy, it is our huge size. We are a mega city. The one of the most largest in the world. We are the 5th largest city in the world. We have 8.5 million inhabitants, but if we are talking about this regional integration that we need, as Dana shared with us, we have 20 million inhabitants when we are talking about our metropolitan zone. I mean, this is huge. We are just only compared in this size with Beijing, with Nueva Delhi, and of course with Sao Paulo here also in Latin America. So daily, and this is a very important number, we are managing 35 million of metropolitan trips in our streets. So this is crazy. I mean, if we try to do some kind of change, we have to do it like in a very huge scale. So that is why it's very important also to have all the elements on the table when we are talking about the changes. And I am talking about policy, I am talking about budget, I am talking about governance, I am talking about also regulation. So the regional integration for us is very important because of this. Another more numbers about our biggest coup. It is also the new mode share survey that we launched in 2017. The 45% of the trips are made by bus and public transport systems. 32% of the journeys are made by walking. This is a very interesting number because a lot of people are walking in Mexico City and the metropolitan area. Nobody is doing a lot about this infrastructure. 21% of the trips are made by cars. I mean, they are like a minority in the mode share system, and 1.1% on bicycle. For all these new digital mobility systems, this mode share is very interesting because the last mile, the first and the last mile, is able to be offered by other systems. And also it is a challenge for the city because we have to take care about the non-motorized mobility. So we have to be very careful on this. Well, and of course, I'm sorry, we have 5.5 million cars with 1.5% average occupation. So this is a disaster. When we're talking about these new services, one of the things that we were expecting about them is to give the users more safety. This is one of the most important priorities for the users. More information about the time, the duration of the journey and the trips, of course. A more transparent tariff, because we used to have a lot of problems with the charging and the pricing systems with the taxi drivers operation, and a more sustainable offer and more quality in the offer of the vehicles in these services. On the other hand, with the taxi driver systems, we have also a lot of problems. They have a lot of regulation over here. They are over-regulated. So they have to do a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy when they are trying to get the permission to operate. They have to fulfill a lot of documentation also that most of them is useless, and they have to face with a lot of bureaucracy and corruption. So the cost of the operation of the taxi driver system is a very high one. And this is one of the most important reasons that they can't offer a better service, because they are spending a lot of money in all this process, including the corruption. So the first thing that we think here when we were trying to regulate these new systems is that we need to regulate the new of course, we need to regulate the new digital mobility services, the new TNC services, but we have to have a new regulation also for the taxi drivers systems. And the first step it was to take out a lot of the regulation that they have right now and do it more efficient. And because, as I said, they are over-regulated right now. So when we started this process, we started, the first step, it was the new mobility law, as I said before. In 2012, when we started all the conversations and the debates in the mobility law, we have this agreement between all the political forces and with the technical team of the government that it will be very important to have a very specific frame in our general regulation on the law in order to create the next regulation, the specific one, the secondary one of these TNCs platforms. So in the Article 7, 9, 14, 15, and 2016 in the mobility law, we talk about this new TNCs regulation, but in a very specific way, opening the opportunity for the executive branch of the government to create a more detailed regulation. So in this mobility law, we are going to find terms as technology, innovation, regulation, and investment, based in a very specific game of words that it is called private services companies. And with this new term that we introduce in the law, we open the debate since this moment in order to create a specific regulation. As I said, this is very important because we need to understand that the technology always will be one step ahead of us. And I am talking about the academy, and I am talking about the think tanks systems, and I am also talking about government. They are always going to be one step ahead of us because they are investing in technology, because they are faster, because they are digital, and that is why they are viral. So we need to be very clear on this, because we have to be prepared in order to manage this innovation. So when we are talking about general frame law, we have to be general in our work over there, because if not, if we want to go very particular in our regulation in the general frame law and not in the executive operational regulation that it belongs to the executive power branch of power, I mean the mayor and their teams and all these more technical teams, if we don't do that, we're going to have a lot of problems, because each change in the Congress, it doesn't matter if it is the local Congress or the state Congress or a federal Congress, each change will take a lot of time in order to achieve it. So when we are talking about this regulation, please think on this. We need to act fast because they are faster than us. So the general framework has to be very general. And then we have to work in the very specific secondary regulation, the executive one, that can be very particular, because you can change it faster, because it is a matter of the technical teams of the city government, not of the Congress or the legislative power. So this proposal, I am going to be faster on this. We started to work it with the Congress, the Legislative Congress in Mexico City, with the technical teams of the city government in Mexico City, and of course with the City Lab, that it is part of the government, but they work a lot with the innovation and with the civil society sector. So we started a debate. We didn't want to have the conversation or the debate just inside the government. We need to open it in terms to have everybody's voices over here, all the stakeholders that we're part of. So in these debates that were led by the City Lab, we created a diverse participatory space for the exchange of ideas and opinions, participation of relevant players, and civic participation. So we create debate, working groups, recommendation of citizenships, conclusions, and then the new regulation, the specific particular one, the executive implementation of these TNCs. It was a very important participatory mechanism, because we build all the new regulation together. The governance is very important, to open the governance and the way that the government is used to do the things. If you do it like in a closer room with no open participation, you're going to have a very lame regulation, and nobody's going to be in, because they are not part of it. So this is one of the key words of our regulatory process construction. So here in these public debates and public open tables, we design and create the regulatory strategies for this regulation. The participants were, of course, everybody. I mean, the private sector, the civil society sector, the academic sector, and of course, the government. And we have in our tables the new TNCs companies, but of course, the taxi drivers organizations. So it was very interesting, and it was a very enriching process too. So this then in July 2015, through all this process, we got the new regulation of Mexico City about the TNCs. One of the standards that we create here in order to make things happen, it was the power to regulate. I mean, we give the government the power to regulate. When we are talking about regulation in digital platforms in the fourth industrial revolution, we have to understand that we have and we need to regulate in order to create it and make it happen. Most of the times, especially in the Latin American countries, we regulate to forbid the behaviors, but this is not the case. We need to regulate in order to create a new order. So this is very important. The regulation is one of the most important things in order to allow the new systems and to be more open with new opportunities for the users. So then also we started to create this drivers data system with vehicle documentation. I mean, all the private companies started to be our most important stakeholders, and they were the providers of this driver's data information. And then we also asked them to give 1.5% of their total journey tariff. It is a small fee compared what they are working on and doing it right now in order to invest into the sustainable mobility agenda. I mean, we are talking about infrastructure, especially for non-motorized mobility and road safety. And we create a public fund in this. So the timeline for this, and I'm going to conclude with these slides. In June of 2014, Uber arrives in Mexico. Then in March in 2015, the taxi drivers and the Uber conflict war started. It was a very ugly thing. Everybody started to got like these fights on the streets, and of course the government has to be part of the solution, not of a more escalated problem. In 2015, the public opinion played a very important role here because from the media, from the newspapers, from the digital platforms, everybody started to ask for a regulation and for a better service for the users. So this was also key for the government because the political costs were less important than if the public opinion is against a regulation like this. So for the mayor and for the public regulators, it was like an easy move to create this regulation. So in 2016, the service of Uber Pool started because we as government asked them for the implementation of this service because we want them to change the way that people are occupying the vehicles in the city. That, as you may see in the first slide that I share with you, we have 1.5 people or persons per car as an occupation rate. This is ridiculous. So we think and thought at that moment that they will be maybe a very good ally to change that and start this pooling operation in the city. So in April of 2016, Uber especially started with this crazy upraising of the tariffs in the city once they started to ask for a new regulation. So this also was a very important trigger for the government to create a regulation because they were charging whatever they want on the streets and nobody once allowed it to say them anything because they weren't regulated. So that was another important issue on the table for us as regulators in order to ask for the mayor and all their political team to put their hands on a new regulation in order to put all these guys in order, as we say here in Mexico. Then in 2016, implementation of taxi apps, they started, the taxi drivers starting with their own apps services in order to compete with the new systems. This also was a good thing because they started to compete in a more equal situation. So for the government, it was very important to support these initiatives. And 2016, we initiate the debates, the public debates, the one that I already told you, in order to create the new regulation together with a very legitimate process, with a very open governance. And finally, then we got the regulation, of course, as you may see. And then in 2016, we started again with problems with the taxi drivers, with public manifestations, with requests for suspensions of Uber Pool, and with international lawsuits against the city, and of course, international lawsuits against the regulation in the Supreme Court. I have to say that we won at that time, and we are still winning all the legal debate. This is a very important thing to do because, I mean, if you are not able to support your legislation, you are going to lose in the Supreme Court or in the international court. So finally, one of our stakeholders here are the operating companies, the dealerships, the NGOs, the experts and the civil society, the government, the automotive companies, the insurers. And in Mexico City right now, as you may see, we have been operating with these new regulations since 3 years ago. We have a lot of data right now to deal with and to start an evaluation process in order to create a new regulation, of course, because when we are talking about digital regulation, we have to know that we have to change it very quickly and very fast, and maybe every 2 years to submit them under a revision, because the things change with a lot of velocity with them. So we don't need an ugly and an old regulation on that. But we also need, and we have a lot of work to do with the taxi driver systems. This public fund was a very untransparent fund. We don't know right now, and we have to talk about corruption, of course, because this is one of the most important things that we have to deal on in Latin American countries, especially. We don't know about the destination of these funds. What we do know is that the taxi driver systems, they have a lot of opportunities to be better right now, and we are not doing the sufficient work in order to achieve it. So the taxi regulation right now is one of the most important challenges for Mexico City in order to create a better one and more opportunities for them to give a better service. The strategic alliances and public and private, with the public and private sector, is very important. With this new application, these new TNC systems, with the scooters, with the bike sharing systems, with all these car on demand systems, how we can start managing as a whole an integral system, comprehensive system, with the public transport system and with the private transport system. So I think that we have a lot of strategic alliances to build on here in a very integrated public transport systems. Then we have also an urban governance challenge, how we can do better in order to create together a better regulation, in order to align all the city goals with the goals of the private sector and the technology sector. This is, for me, the most important part of the work, because this can happen if you open the conversation and if you open the debate and if you establish a very open and a transparent table of this discussion table in order to achieve it. So you can tell to them, you know what, this is our 5 most important goals in the next 10 years in the matter of sustainability and safe mobility systems. So how we can do this together. So I think that is one of the missing parts of the public conversations in all the countries right now. Then, of course, the electric vehicles change in our regulation. I mean, we should ask for these TNCs to introduce hybrid and electric vehicles in their fleet. And the data collection and planning, this is one of the most important things right now. They are not cooperating with the government with this, and this is a very important challenge. And of course, as I said, the evaluation. So this is it, and we are open for your questions. We have a lot to learn about the exercise, for example, of Sao Paulo, when we are talking about data management. But I think that as the first Latin American city who regulates the TNCs, I think that we create at that time a very complete regulation, and now it is the time to have an open and a new conversation to improve it. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Laura. I'm going to jump into the Q&A session with our attendees, and I'm just going to share my screen here before we get started. Okay, great. So the first question I have here, I will direct to Dana. One of our attendees asked about the surcharges based on occupancy rates being explored in San Francisco. Do you mind just revisiting that topic and elaborate what San Francisco is currently doing?
Of course, yeah. So this is actually a proposed ballot measure that will be voted on in 2019, but the proposal is for a varying percentage surcharge on TNC trips based on whether those trips are single trips. So if you're just ordering a regular like Uber or Lyft just for a personal trip versus a pooled trip. So I believe the proposal is a 1.5% fee on a pooled trip versus a 3.5% fee on a personal or single trip. So that's the idea of having a higher fee for a lower occupancy rate.
Great, thank you, Dana. And the next question here, I'm going to direct to Laura. One of our attendees asked, what are some of the road safety risks associated with TNCs? And considering you've been involved with implementing Vision Zero Mexico City, perhaps you can talk a bit more about improving road safety associated with these services.
Yes, absolutely. Well, with this public fund that we created at that time, one percentage, part of the percentage of the fund, it was going to be directly invested in infrastructure on the street regarding on safe infrastructure. And the other part of the fund, the other percentage, it was going to be directed an investment for the taxi driver systems in order to improve it, like capacitation and technology and stuff like that. So with the part that it was the investment or infrastructure for safer streets, we invested money on safer intersections. With this Vision Zero strategy, as you may know, one of our most important goals was the speed management. So with the new signing, with a new system on the streets that allowed the speed management of the cars, it was one of our most important work on the streets in that matter. We create with this fund specifically 50 safe intersections. And the new, like a new guideline for bicycle infrastructure too. The new cyclist infrastructure that was created since we started this work in 2015, it is oriented by this new guideline. Specifically too, when we are talking about the scooters and the bike sharing systems, because they are different kind of TNCs companies regarding the Uber and the Cabify ones. They weren't part of the work that I made, because this was part of the work of the new government. But I have to say that one of the most important challenges when we are talking about road safety here is that we need to also manage the speed of these new vehicles. And to be very, very serious about the space that they are going to occupy. I mean, they can be part of the sidewalks. They can use the sidewalks to circulate. They have to use the roads. They need more infrastructure regarding like more cyclist infrastructure in order to do it like in a more safety way, but they can be part of the pedestrian mobility system and use that infrastructure. And of course, we can also ask them in the regulation to have governors, speed governors in their vehicles to have a better control of their speed on the streets. So of course, capacitation for the users. I mean, this is part of the road safety ecosystem that we need to improve, but it is part of our mindset right now.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. This next question, I will direct at Dana. One of our attendees is asking more about if there have been any public-private partnerships that you have seen, or perhaps initiatives regarding first last mile.
Sure, yeah, there have been a number of pilot programs in the US where transit agencies and TNCs have partnered to provide for TNCs to provide first last mile to transit stations. It kind of the structure of those programs differs from city to city. In some cases, there's a subsidy that's provided for those TNC trips. In some cases, those trips are free. A good example right now that's going on is the microtransit pilot in LA, which is using Via, which is a smaller transportation network company, for first last mile. So there's a number of these programs. They've had varied amounts of success, which I think is interesting. In a lot of cases, they've run for a couple of months as a pilot and then haven't necessarily been adopted more long term. So there are some cases that are out there. It's a little bit unclear whether these are actually have been able to be successful.
Great, thank you, Dana. It's still really great to hear about different pilots going on, and hopefully we can keep track of if there's any scaling up. And then this will actually be our last question today as we enter our last minute, and this will be directed at you, Laura. Zach here asks, we've heard news stories of TNCs providing cities with data that has been manipulated to meet regulatory standards. So from your experience with Mexico City specifically, and if Dana wants to jump in later, perhaps you could give a high-level overview. Have you found that verification practices improve to ensure jurisdictions are receiving valid data from these companies?
Not yet, and this is why the next steps of this new administration and the other administrations all around the world is to have a better enforcement on this. I mean, they are giving whatever they want, if they want, and of course, you don't have the capacity to know if they are giving you the proper or the right information because you are not spying them on their databases, basically. So one of the things that this new administration started to do with this in order to change this problem, to solve it, is to ask for the scooters and the bike sharing companies for a full access into the databases, like a password in order to have full access into the databases systems. But this will be a very important legal battle because the companies don't want to open a full access for their databases because, I mean, they have to protect the information, the personal information of the users. This is a very important part too. We have to bring all over the table in this discussion all the specialists and experts that are working in the open data systems and in the personal data protection, because we as transport experts, we want to have a lot of information in order to plan and evaluate, but we have to take care about the other legal things that are very important. If not, as I said, you are going to lose your battles in the court. So I think that the government is going to lose this legal battle because this full access, it is not allowed by any city law or country law, as you may know. So that is why it's very tricky. I think that once the government started to create their own platforms in order to integrate all the systems, that will be a very first step to solve this problem, because we're going to be part of the solution and not just going to ask for the information. Right now, I also can say that most of the governments, and this is true, we don't need all the data that they have. We just need a very small piece. Timothy Papandreou, that he's very into these things, he said last time I talked with him that maybe we just need like five or six indicators in order to plan, and we are asking for 20 or 30 because we don't quite know yet what we do need as city planners.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And that question will actually conclude our session for today. I saw that there were some specific questions regarding numbers and, for example, curbside management or the bill that was mentioned for California. I can follow up with those individuals via email. But overall, we really encourage everyone to read our new report, Ride Fair, a policy framework for managing TNCs. And also we'd like to thank Laura Ballesteros today for giving us a deep dive look into the first Latin American city that had a regulatory framework. And if you would like to send any specific questions to her, you'll have my contact information in the follow-up email, and I can reach out to Laura. But again, thank you so much for those who attended, and thank you to you, Dana and Laura.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye, y'all.